Hello, Barry Island Primary School.
Hello!
You all know me as Mr. Nelson, who works for the Wales Coastal Monitoring Centre. Through your school's programme, you've been looking at coastal defences and coastal flooding. Today, we're lucky to have Mr. Moon, who is the Environment Engineering Manager of Vale of Glamorgan Council and is responsible for managing the defences local to you. Mr. Moon, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, Mr. Nelson. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me into your class this morning. As Mr. Nelson said, I work as an engineer for the Vale of Glamorgan Council, and part of my role is I'm responsible for managing flood and coastal risk in the Vale of Glamorgan. Who's got a question for me this morning?
When and where was the most recent flood in Barry?
Oh, let me think. Good question. The last flooding we had was probably June last year, when we had flash flooding that affected some roads and a couple of properties in the west of Barry. But the last really significant flooding we had in Barry was actually in July 2007, and we had 100 houses flood and 4 schools. But fortunately, since 2007, we've built a scheme in Barry we've improved the pipes and some culverts, and we've cleared out the watercourses, so we didn't have any flooding in that area last year. Who's got the next question?
From our research, we found out that the Knap has a 1 in 200 year flood risk. What has put into place to protect this area?
Oh, thank you. Actually, not very much. That's an interesting area. That part of our coastline doesn't actually have many houses at risk of tidal flooding, so flooding from the sea. Those of you know that the houses are all a little bit higher up above the lake, and although there are some structures down there, there's not many houses at risk of flooding. So our policy for managing that part of the coastline is actually something called managed realignment. So over time, maybe not in my lifetime, but maybe in yours, we'll look at realigning the coastline there and letting the shingle barrier move where it wants to be. So as we get increased sea levels and wave energy coming into the shore, we'll probably see the waves start to overtop that shingle ridge. And the way we're going to manage the coastline there is to let that sort of evolve. And we'll have to think about what that looks like and how we manage it. Now, hopefully that answers that. What's the next question?
Where is the highest flood risk area in the Vale of Glamorgan?
Ooh, another good question. I think we have lots of little pockets all over the Vale of Glamorgan. So we have little clusters, little villages with a little bit of flood risk, maybe from surface water, so when it rains really heavily. But there's 2 main areas where we've got the most risk from rivers, where there's a bit more significant risk and it get a bit deeper. One of those is Cowbridge, where we've got probably nearly 200 properties and lots of businesses at risk of flooding. But fortunately, Natural Resources Wales, who are an organisation responsible for managing flood risk from rivers, have a big storage area or an embankment built above the town, which helps protect the houses. So actually, they are at risk, but it's a managed risk because there's a structure there. At the moment, the biggest risk in the Vale is probably in Dinas Powys, in the east of the Vale, where again we've got nearly 200 houses at risk of flooding from the river, as well as at risk of surface water flooding, and a little bit lower in the catchment down towards Surrey Moors. There's also lots of industrial sites at risk of flooding from the river as well, so I think that's where the biggest risk of flooding is, in the Vale of Glamorgan. Okay, who's got the next question?
We noticed that some of our new houses down by the docks has been built in a flood risk area. What is being done to protect them?
Oh, that's a good question. Those houses, they have a lovely view down by the dock and looking out over the water, but you're right, you'd think they were at risk of flooding. When the designers looked at that estate, they decided that they were actually going to lift up all the ground levels around the houses and the floor levels of the houses so that they're higher than the predicted highest extreme tides or water levels. So all those houses are actually, they've been picked up so that tidal flooding shouldn't ever get into them unless you have a really, really big event, but they've planned for quite an extreme event. And when they look at how high to lift the floor levels up, they also add a bit on for climate change, which I'm sure you've all been doing some research around and learning about. So at the moment, the scientists are predicting how much sea level rise we're going to get over the next 100 years, and it's about a metre. So the designers have made sure that those floor levels are raised up high enough so the water doesn't get in even on a really high tide. Now, if our predictions aren't right, probably not me, but maybe one of you, if you become a coastal engineer or an engineer, might have to put something in place. If we've got it wrong and there's a bit more sea level rise, then we may have to build defences in the future. Okay, who's got the next question?
What are the most expensive coastal flooding defences in the Vale of Glamorgan, and what are they?
Ooh, now we don't actually have that many coastal flood defences in the Vale of Glamorgan, but the most expensive coast defences we've built recently is probably the rock revetment that goes around Barry Old Harbour. So as you go onto Barry Island, there's lots of rock right alongside the road. And that was put in because we wanted to manage the risk of erosion. Some of the old revetments were starting to fail. So we've spent, over a couple of years, we spent several £100,000 bringing in rock and making a nice revetment around the side there to protect it and stop it eroding away. Although the main role is to protect against erosion, actually, if we do get waves going into the old harbour through the narrow entrance, the waves, the rock takes some of the energy out of the waves, so it reduces the amount of flooding that happens onto the road behind. And in some way, the new houses behind as well benefit, because that stops any water getting over and back towards that estate as well. Okay, we're rattling through these questions. Are there any more questions?
Has Vale of Glamorgan got any plans to use hard or soft engineering to protect any more of our coast in the future?
Good question. Yes, but only in areas where there are already defences. So when we look at our coastline and decide where to spend our money and where to defend, we have something called a shoreline management plan, and we use that as a tool to look at how the shoreline is likely to evolve over time, how many houses, properties, businesses are at risk of either flooding or coastal erosion, and where we're best to spend our money and defend. In the Vale of Glamorgan, a lot of our coastline is high cliffs, or there's high ground behind the coastline, so there's actually not a lot of risk of flooding along a long section of the coastline to the west. Now in places like Barry, it's a bit lower, so we probably will have to spend some money there. So places like Barry Island, Whitmore Bay, we've got existing defences there, and over time we repair those if they get damaged in storms, but we may also have to change those in the future. Potentially we could use soft engineering, so we could try and bring, if the sand levels dropped on Barry Island, we could try and bring in sand to maintain the beach, to maintain the amenity. Or we could decide that actually we'll try and retreat a bit. It's a bit tricky on Barry Island because it rises up quite steeply behind, so going backwards into the funfair would be a bit challenging. In other areas, where can I think, like the Knap and Cwm Colliw in Llantwit Major, we'll probably need to think about how do we move some of the structures in those areas. So the Knap, there's a big shingle beach that protects the lake behind and some of the houses there. It's a natural feature. If we get sea level rise and more storms, that beach might start to roll back inland, so the storms will push it back in. If that happens, we'll have to think about how do we manage that. We haven't done it here, but I've worked elsewhere in the country where we've actually used big dumper trucks to pick up gravel, shingle, move it around and put it back where it came from, so more soft engineering. Alternatively, we may say we'll leave the gravel where it is and we'll let the sea come in a bit, but we'll build walls around the back to make sure that no one else floods because more water can get through. That's another option. Down at Llantwit Major, there's some rock revetment there that sticks out into the beach a bit, next to the car park and the lifeguard station. Over time, if sea level goes up and that structure starts to get damaged, we may have to look at setting that back and pulling back up, and that again probably needs some hard engineering. But I prefer to let the beach do what it wants to do naturally, because at the moment that rockwork stops some of the big rocks and cobbles on the beach and moving along the beach, longshore drift, which you may have learnt about. So the material gets moved along by waves. That structure actually slows the drift down and blocks it in places. So it may be that in the future, with sea level rise, as we roll back, we have to think about, do we need more hard defences, or can we use a softer approach and actually move back inland so that the beach can do what it wants in front? Okay, hopefully that answers that question. Any more questions anyone would like to ask?
That's all of our questions. What do we have to say, Year 5?
Thank you.
Thank you, excellent.
Well done, class. There's been some amazing questions. Next time you travel to Barry Island along Harbour Road, who's going to have a look at the new rock revetment that Mr. Boone's put out? All of you. Okay, well, thanks everybody, and we'll speak to you soon. Bye all.
Bye.
Bye.